Her knees struck packed snow. A clawed hand seized her braid and forced her face down toward the frozen ground of the council circle. She did not cry out. She did not beg. She bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, and she kept her eyes on the boot prints in the snow in front of her. 12 cloaked figures stood in a half-ring along the high stone wall of the council court. Their breath made 12 slow plumes in the lantern light. The torches snapped in the wind. A man on the central dais lifted a scroll of charges. His voice carried over the bowed heads of the assembled pack. Theft, he read. Treason. Betrayal of the crown. A clawed hand tightened in her hair. She was 22 years old. She had stolen nothing. But she had crossed a border. And she had brought back a thing that was not hers to take. And in the kingdom of wolves, that was enough. Stay with me on this one. She had not always been a kneeling thing. There had been a time, long before this winter, when she had run through the birch woods behind the bathhouses with her sister at her heels, both of them shrieking with laughter, neither of them old enough yet to know they were unwanted. Her sister had died of the red fever in the spring of her 9th year. Her mother had died on the same day. Her father had not died. Her father had walked out into the rain with a coat folded over his arm, and he had never come back through the kitchen door of the small stone cottage on the edge of the pack lands. The neighbors had said for a week that he was off looking for work in the southern packs. Then they had stopped saying it. He had been seen drinking in the southern packs. He had been seen with a new woman in the southern packs. He had been seen with a new child in the southern packs. She had been left in the cottage with a tin of salt, 3 potatoes, and a bone broth her mother had cooked the day before she died. She had been 9 years old. The pack had not taken her in. The pack had assigned her to the laundry house of the bathkeepers, where she had earned a wool pallet under the drying frames and 1 bowl of porridge a day in exchange for hauling baskets and turning the great wooden mangles until her shoulders ached. The bathkeepers had not been cruel. They had simply not been kind. They had not known how. She had grown up among them like a stray cat that had wandered into a barn, tolerated for what it caught, ignored for the rest. By the time she was 16, the pack had a name for her. They called her the Unspoken. It was not a curse. It was a description. She did not speak. She had not spoken aloud, except in single words to the bathkeepers when work required it, since the year her mother had died. She had not lost the ability. She had simply lost the use of it. She had nothing to say to a pack that had let a 9-year-old girl bury her sister alone behind the cottage with a tin spade. At 18, the keepers had presented her to the pack alpha as an omega of working age. The alpha had taken one look at her gaunt face and her chapped hands and her bowed head, and had assigned her to the laundry permanently. No mate. No house. No second name. She had not minded. She had her own pallet by then, in a narrow room behind the boiler. She had a window the size of a soup plate that looked out on the birch woods. She had a tin of salt of her own. It had been enough. Then last autumn she had begun to slip out at night. She had told herself the first time that she only wanted to walk. She had walked along the laundry path to the river. She had stood at the edge of the river and watched the moon slide on the water. She had walked back. The second time she had crossed the river. The third time she had gone deeper into the birch woods on the far bank, where the soil began to slope upward toward the territory of the northern pack. The northern pack was the king's pack. She had known. Every wolf in the kingdom knew where the border lay. But the moonlight on the birch trunks had been so white, and the air on the far side of the river had smelled so different from the laundry steam, and the lie that she had kept walking. 3 nights running. 4. 5. The far woods were empty in the small hours. The patrols passed in the upper meadows, far above where she walked. She heard them sometimes, distant, the brass of their lantern frames clinking against their belt buckles. She always froze. She always waited. They always passed her by. Then in the 6th week of her walking, she had come on the pup. He was a male, perhaps 4 moons old, lying on his side at the foot of a snow bank. a wolf in his second skin, half changed, with the gray fur of his hindquarters and the bare pink shoulder of his half-turned form. One of his back legs had been caught in a wire snare. The snare was the kind a poacher set for rabbit. The wire had cut down through the muscle of his thigh to the bone. He had not whined when she had come up. He had only looked at her with eyes the color of wet slate. He was the king's pup. She had not known then. She had known only that he was somebody's pup, and that he was 4 moons old, and that he was bleeding into the snow. She had taken the wire off his leg with her teeth. She had carried him on her hip down the long slope to the river. She had waded across the river up to her waist with him bundled in her arms, and her own coat wrapped around him. She had brought him into the laundry through the back door, and she had laid him on her own pallet, and she had washed the wound in the boiling water of the wash troughs, and packed it with the salve the keepers used for the burned scalds on their hands. She had hidden him for 11 days. She had fed him broth from her own bowl. She had stolen mutton fat from the kitchen for him in a folded handkerchief. She had sat up with him through 3 nights of fever, and she had washed his wound twice a day with hot water and salt, and she had pressed her forehead to his small, bony skull, and she had whispered to him, for the first words she had spoken in years, that he was not going to die. He had not died. On the 11th day, he had been strong enough to walk. She had carried him back across the river in the gray pre-dawn light, and she had set him down at the foot of the upper meadow path, where the king's patrol always passed at dawn. She had stroked his ears one last time. He had licked her wrist. She had walked back across the river and into the laundry and back to her pallet, and she had thought it was finished. It had not been finished. The patrol had found the pup. The patrol had brought him to the king. The pup had told the king, in the broken half-words of a 4-moon wolf, that a dark-haired woman from the bath-houses across the river had pulled the wire out of his leg with her teeth. The king had sent men. The men had come for her at the laundry door at the 3rd hour, past midnight. They had not told her why. They had not told her where. They had only seized her by the upper arms and dragged her out across the snow path and down the river road, and up the long slope to the king's territory in chains. By the morning of the 2nd day, she had been in the king's holding cell. By the morning of the 3rd, she had been in the council court on her knees. A clawed hand tightened in her braid. The man on the dais finished reading the scroll. The pup, he said, was the heir. A murmur ran through the half-ring of counselors. He looked up from the scroll. His eyes found her bowed head in the snow. "You crossed the border," he said. "You laid hands on the heir. You hid him from his sire for 11 days. You returned him without permit, without payment, without word. You will answer the council. You will name your accomplice in the southern pack. You will surrender the names of the poachers who set the snare. You will speak." She did not speak. The clawed hand pulled her head back so that the lantern light fell across her face. She kept her eyes closed. "I will say it again," the man on the dais said. "You will speak." She did not. The counselors murmured to each other in low voices behind their hands. The man on the dais raised one finger. "Bring the iron," he said. A boy came forward from the dark archway behind the dais, carrying a long iron rod with a glowing tip. The tip was shaped like a crescent that had been snapped in half. The exile sigil. The brand that meant she was no longer of any pack. The brand that meant any wolf in any territory could kill her on sight and answer to no law. She did not open her eyes. She had decided in the holding cell that she would not speak. She had thought about it for the whole long 2nd day. She had thought that if she spoke she would have to name the pup. She would have to say his fur color. She would have to say the slate gray of his eyes. She would have to admit she had touched him, washed him, fed him, lain beside him in the dark with her cheek against his small ribs. She would have to give the council the shape of him and let the council use that shape against the king, against the pup, against whatever wider thing the council was reaching for. She had decided in the cell that her silence was the only thing she had left that was worth keeping. She had decided that she would let them brand her. She had decided that she would walk out of the council court in exile, and she would walk south through the woods until she found a river deep enough and she would walk into it. She had not decided to be saved. She heard the iron come closer through the snow. She heard a counselor draw in a breath. She did not hear the door at the back of the council court open. The door opened on hinges so well oiled that they made no sound. She heard, instead, the boy with the iron stop walking. She heard the iron lower toward the snow. She heard the boy take 3 steps backward. She heard the snow crunch under a slow, heavy stride coming up the center aisle of the council court. She did not open her eyes. If you are still with me, hit that subscribe button. The stride stopped 1 pace behind her. A voice spoke above her head. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The council court had gone so quiet that she could hear the candle wax dripping from the lantern overhead onto the snow. Release her hair, the voice said. The clawed hand fell from her braid. A hand closed around her chin and lifted it. The hand was gloved in black leather, and the leather was soft and warm against her cold skin. The hand turned her face up toward the lantern light. She opened her eyes. She had never seen him before. She had heard him described. Every wolf in the kingdom had heard him described. He was tall. He was dark. He had a streak of pure white in the hair above his right temple. He had eyes the color of wet slate. The same eyes as the pup. She understood then, in the long heartbeat before he spoke, what she had done. She had not rescued a stray. She had rescued the king's son. He looked down into her face for a long moment. He did not speak. He searched her face as if he were looking for something he had been told would be there. He must have found it because his jaw tightened once, very slightly, and the corner of his mouth pulled in. Then he leaned closer. He brought his mouth almost to her ear. He whispered 5 words. Mine. By blood. By bond. The council court did not breathe. A counselor at the end of the half-ring dropped a scroll. The scroll rolled in the snow and stopped against the toe of the boy with the iron rod. The man on the dais opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. Your Majesty, he said. The Alpha King did not look at him. He kept his eyes on her face. He brushed his gloved thumb very gently along her jaw. You will not brand her, he said. His voice was no louder than the whisper had been. The whole court heard him anyway. The man on the dais drew himself up. Your Majesty, he said with respect. The law is clear. The intruder crossed the border. The intruder hid the air. The intruder refuses to answer. The law requires. The Alpha King lifted his head slowly. He turned his face toward the dais. The man on the dais did not finish his sentence. She has answered, the Alpha King said. She has answered me. She is mine. By blood. By bond. By the right of the mate mark, which supersedes every law of this council and every charge on that scroll. He looked back down at her. Stand up, he said quietly. You will not kneel in this court again. She tried to stand. Her knees would not hold her. The cold had gone into them through the snow, and they had locked. He bent down. He slid an arm beneath her elbow and an arm beneath her knees. He lifted her against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. Her face turned without permission into the warm wool of his collar. He smelled of cedar and clean leather and the faint smoke of a low fire. She had not been held by anyone since the year she was 9. The council court watched in silence as he carried her toward the dais. He stopped in front of the man with the scroll. You will dismiss the charges, the Alpha King said. You will dismiss them in writing. You will read the dismissal aloud before this court, before the sun rises. You will append a note in your own hand that the woman in my arms is the fated mate of the Alpha King, and that any wolf who lays a finger on her will answer to me in single combat at the standing stones at dawn. The man on the dais bowed his head. Yes, your Majesty, he said. Find the poachers, the Alpha King said. Find them today. Bring me their names by sundown. Yes, your Majesty. He turned without waiting for further answer, and he walked her back down the center aisle of the council court and out through the high oak doors and into the snow of the upper courtyard, where a sleigh was waiting with 4 black horses harnessed and steaming in the cold. He set her down on the velvet bench of the sleigh. He climbed in beside her. He drew a heavy fur up over her lap and over her shoulders, and he tucked it under her chin with the gentleness of a man wrapping bread. "Drive," he said to the driver. The sleigh moved. She did not say a word. He did not ask her to. They rode through the white woods for an hour. The black horse's breath made twin clouds in the air. The runners hissed on the snow. He sat beside her without touching her. He kept his gloved hands on his knees. After a long time, he spoke without looking at her. "My son told me your face," he said quietly. "He told me the smell of your hands. He told me that you sang to him on the second night when his fever was the worst. He told me you said his name. He had not told me his name yet. He said you guessed it." She had not guessed his name. She had only said the only soft word she still remembered from her sister's lullabies. The word had been "little one." She did not say so. He glanced sideways at her. Then back to the horses. "I have looked for you," he said, "for 4 moons. She turned her face toward him very slowly. "I did not know I was being looked for," she said. It was the first sentence she had spoken aloud in 14 years. He closed his eyes for a moment. He did not pretend he had not heard the catch in her throat. He did not pretend her voice did not break on the word "looked." "I am sorry it took so long," he said. "The patrol gave me your scent at sundown last week. The trackers lost it twice at the river. They found it again this morning at the door of your laundry. I rode through the night. I came to the door of the holding cell at the 2nd hour, and they would not open it without the council's seal. I rode for the council's seal. I came back as fast as a horse will go." She looked at her hands inside the fur. "You said 5 words," she said. He looked at her. "I meant them," he said. "Every one. I will say them again later when you have eaten and slept. I will say them as many times as you need to hear them." She nodded once. She did not know yet what to do with any of it. She knew only that the sleigh was warm and that the man beside her smelled of cedar, and that for the first time in 14 years a sentence had come out of her mouth and another person had bent his head to catch it. The sleigh came up the long rise of the king's seat at the end of the 2nd hour. His name was Eric Stormhall. His son's name was Wren. Her name, when at last he asked her for it in the warm hall of the king's house with a cup of broth in her hands and a low fire at her feet, was Solveig. He repeated it once softly, as if he wanted to keep it. "Solveig," he said. It was the first time her own name had been said gently in 14 years. She put down the cup of broth so that he would not see her hands shake. He saw anyway. He did not say anything. He only set his own cup down beside hers and rose, and put another log on the fire and came back and sat down again across from her on the low bench. She could hear far down the corridor a small high voice. "The puppy. Wren." He was awake. He was asking for someone in the impatient half-words of a four-moon child. Eric heard him too. He smiled. It was a small smile. The smile of a man who had been carrying a heavy thing and had been allowed to set it down. "He wants to see you," he said. "He has been asking since the patrol brought him in. I told him to wait. I will go and tell him you are here. I will not bring him to you unless you say so. You have had a very long week." She found her voice again. "Bring him," she said. He nodded. He rose. He left the hall. She sat alone on the low bench by the fire with the cup of broth in her hands and the heavy fur still over her shoulders, and she watched the flames move on the hearthstones, and she waited to see what would happen next. She did not have to wait long. A small body came tumbling through the door at the end of the hall and across the carpet on 4 uneven legs, and pressed itself against her knees with the full weight of his small chest. He smelled of warm milk and pine resin and clean linen. His back leg was bound in a clean white wrap. He laid his small head in her lap, and he made a low sound that was almost a sigh, the sound a creature makes when it has come home. She put her hand on the small bony skull. She did not weep. She had wept enough. She looked up. The Alpha King stood in the doorway with his shoulder against the frame. He was watching her with the pup. He was not smiling. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a thing he has been told he was allowed to want. She held his gaze. "I am tired," she said. "I would like to sleep." He nodded. He came across the hall on quiet feet. He bent and gathered the pup in one arm and held out his free hand to her. "Come," he said. "I will show you the room." The room was simple. A high window, a low bed, a wash basin, a small fire on a stone hearth, a wool gown laid out across a chair, the size her keepers would have known to make for her. He set the pup down on the rug by the fire. The pup curled at once. He stayed. The Alpha King stood at the door. "You are safe here," he said quietly. "The door does not lock from outside. It only locks from in. The bolt is heavy. You will hear it slide. No one can open it but you. I will be down the corridor. The pup will stay if you wish." She nodded. He stepped back into the corridor. He paused with his hand on the door frame. "I said 5 words in the council court," he said. "I want to say 5 more here." She waited. "You do not owe me anything," he said. He closed the door gently behind him. She stood for a long time in the middle of the room, with her hand pressed flat against the wool of the gown on the chair. Then she walked to the bed and she sat down on its edge, and she looked at the pup curled by the fire, and she thought, for the first time in 14 years, that she would like to be awake tomorrow. She slid the bolt on the door. She lay down on the bed. She slept. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, a small wolf breathed evenly on the rug. Down the corridor, a man with a streak of white in his hair sat in a chair against the wall of his own chamber with his sword across his knees, and he watched the closed door, and he did not sleep at all. In the morning, he would speak to the council. In the morning, he would name her before the court. In the morning, the kingdom would learn that the Alpha King had taken a fated mate from across the river, and that the law of the council had bowed before the law of the bond. There would be a hearing. There would be old elders who would not bend. There would be a southern pack that would seize the moment to push at the border. There would be a winter that was not yet done. But that was for the morning. The southern pack would hear by sundown. Their alpha was a man named Havard who had pushed at the king's borders for 3 winters. He would call his lieutenants to a low room behind the smithy, and he would tell them the king had taken a mate. He would say it as a problem. An unbonded king is a king who can be reasoned with. A bonded king is a king who will burn his own roof for the woman under it. Havard would send a writer to the council of elders. The writer would carry a sealed letter. The letter would propose an alliance. The letter would be carried, by a quiet man who had served the king's father, directly into the hand of the Alpha King at noon of the 2nd day. The king would read it once. He would fold it. He would put it in his inner pocket. He would say nothing of it to Solveig. He would tell her instead that second morning, when she came down to the warm hall with the pup at her heels and her dark hair in a loose braid down her back, that he had ordered the keepers of the king's house to prepare a small chamber off the hall for her, with a window that looked over the eastern woods, and that he had sent for a healer who knew the work of voice and throat to come and sit with her in the afternoons for as long as she wished. He would tell her that no one in his house would speak above a low voice in any room that she was in until she said otherwise. He would tell her that the pup was now hers as much as his, and that there was a wool basket by the eastern hearth waiting for the pup to lie in or refuse, as the pup chose. She would listen to all of this with her hands folded around a cup of warm milk. She would say, when he was done, that she would like to take a walk in the eastern woods. He would say yes. She would say that she would like to walk alone. He would say yes again. He would only ask, in the same quiet voice he had used in the sleigh, that she stay within the bell of the inner watch. She would nod. She would set down the cup of milk. She would step out the eastern door of the king's house into the cold morning with the pup at her heels, and the wool of the king's house cloak around her shoulders, and the snow new and clean under her boots. She would walk for an hour. She would not speak. She would not need to. For the first time in 14 years, she would walk through a stand of birch trees in the morning, and she would not be walking toward a river that she meant to step into. She would be walking back. The pup would run ahead of her on 3 good legs and the half-wrap of his 4th. He would stop and look back to see that she was still behind him. He would wait. She would catch up. He would go on. When she came back through the eastern door at the end of the hour, the Alpha King would be in the hall with a folded letter in his hand and a cold cup of broth at his elbow, and the look of a man who had been waiting, without moving for the full hour she had been gone. He would rise when she came in. He would not speak first. She would speak first. She would say, "I will stand with you at the hearing." He would nod once. She would say, "I do not know yet what bond means." He would nod again. She would say, "I would like to learn." And the Alpha King, who had whispered 5 words in a frozen council court and had been believed by every wolf within hearing, would set his folded letter down on the long oak table and would cross the hall to her and would take her hands in his and would say, more quietly than anything he had ever said in his life, that he would teach her if she would teach him in return, because he did not know yet either, and that they would learn the shape of the thing together, day by day. In the warm rooms of his house and the cold woods around it, until the shape was clear. She would nod. She would not let go of his hands. The pup would lie down across both of their feet. And the morning would go on. That night, in the warm dark of the king's house, an Omega named Solveig, who had not been called by her name in 14 years, slept under a wool blanket with her hand resting on the side of the bed, where the pup had pulled himself up to lie against her ribs in the small hours. And down the corridor, the man who had whispered 5 words in a frozen council court watched her door and waited for dawn, and for the first time in his life, he understood why his father had once told him that a mate is not a thing you find. A mate is a thing you stand for. He had stood. He would stand again. He would stand for as long as there was breath in him and snow on the ground, and a small wolf breathing under a wool blanket at the end of the corridor of his own house. And in the morning he would begin.